Okay, class, welcome to our recording for the week of January 25th. I'm picking up where we left off on Friday on understanding animal behavior and the video that we showed. Oops. Okay, so now I want to take a second and do a quick poll. How important is dominance for successful dog training? Okay, thank you for your answers. We'll discuss those answers in discussion, obviously, because this part is not particular life. But I wanted to highlight some areas and things that we'll be talking about and moving forward in this course. I'd like to next show some quick little videos. This was one that was recently shared with me that was quite cute. Give me just a sec. And okay.
What's the most idiotic idea still being pushed by dog trainers? Without a doubt, it is most definitely dominance. The idea that you need to be dominant over your dog. The last 10 years of animal behavior research is showing that that is garbage. Dogs repeat behaviors that get them what they want, and they avoid behaviors that get them what they don't want.
Okay. So, as you can see, depending on what your answers happen to have been, perhaps maybe some of you have some of those misconceptions. I would say typically when I ask this class in previous years, about 90% or so would indicate that it is very important or extremely important. This is something that has been portrayed throughout in the media. And in reality, this is the history of it is not particularly clear, except that dominance as a concept has been a part of ethology and animal behavior for a long time. And it's not quite right to also say that dominance doesn't exist. It's just that we've built this kind of conceptualization that dominance is what leads to good training, that you have to be dominant, and it's not even clear necessarily what that means. In an animal behavior perspective, we can talk about dominance in dogs or in chimpanzees or in other species simply as essentially deferential access to some type of valuable resource. So for example, if there were two dogs or two chimps and there was some type of food resource, if one of them would have first access to it, a lot of times that would be considered dominance. However, the relationships are not that simple. A lot of times individuals who in other situations would be the less dominant one will get preferred access to that food source because there's no sort of linear conceptualization that we like to make it out to be, that there is a dominant animal and a less dominant animal. The dominant animal gets everything and the less dominant animal gets nothing. It's a much more complicated scenario than that. And then trying to translate that between the human and the dog relationship is even more complicated, to the point that a lot of times it just doesn't even make good sense. Anyway, okay. We'll talk about more of that sort of within the entire semester, but now we're going to focus our attention mostly to a little bit of animal behavior history, different perspectives that there are on animal behavior. For the most part, all of these perspectives are sort of still within existence. So a lot of times there's, most individuals kind of have leanings towards one perspective over another, but largely all of them are kind of integrated in what I consider modern study of animal behavior. But they've largely just come out of different roots, different histories, different focus on different aspects of animal behavior. And in reality, all are necessary one way or another for a particular behavior, but we'll talk about sort of the history and the focus of each one of those. We'll then talk about levels of questioning in Tinbergen's 4 questions. And we'll see how the 4 perspectives of animal behavior apply to that. And then lastly, we'll talk about anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism. These take-home point slides really are just to highlight, these are the things that I want you to, when you're looking back and doing your study before an exam, if you can look at each one of these, define them, understand them, use them in novel context, be able to say, how would a behaviorist approach this situation versus an ethologist? How can I look at this behavior and address Tinbergen's 4 questions with that? That's the kind of level that I need you to get out of these kinds of presentations to be able to do well on your exams. Okay, so next, what is comparative psychology? It's basically the behavior of animals, human and non-human, through a comparative lens. So how does the behavior of human versus the non-human engage, or what types of things do they engage in, what types of behaviors do they do, as well as really a comparison of what are the cognitive processes and differences between when an animal does something versus a human does something. If the two do and behave identically under the same conditions, are there identical underlying cognitive processes that are sort of evolutionarily conserved between those two species? So a lot of times in comparative psychology, we're not only just comparing humans to some other species, but also some species to evolutionarily close species to evolutionarily different species. So a lot of times we might compare different birds together that are evolutionarily similar to animals that are distantly related to birds, like rodents. Sometimes we'll compare domestic dogs to wolves, who are evolutionarily quite close, and compare that to maybe another canid like a fox, or perhaps even just a different animal like a human or a chimpanzee. Comparative psychology is basically looking at behavior, cognition through comparison of different species and how they engage in those kinds of behaviors. And then the next question is, well, what is behavior? Our textbook goes into a bit of a definition of behavior. And one of the things that it talks about is essentially everything that an animal or human does, whether it be overt, that you can observe it, or non-overt, so covert, things like thinking, cognitive processes. Our textbook takes the approach that actually all of these really count as behavior. So when you're interested in animal thinking, the cognitive processes that are going on, those themselves are actual instances of behavior that are worthy of understanding and trying to analyze. So for our purposes, behavior is going to be the coordinated response of the whole living organism. So as I was just talking about, then what does that mean for things like thoughts, feelings, sensations? And in this case, in the approach of our book, that means that we would actually include things like thinking and feeling as behavior in of itself, not necessarily something that is separate. So you don't say that there's something that's behavioral and something that's cognitive. In fact, cognition is behavior in the same way as that is an emotional response, not a behavioral response. It doesn't make sense within this definition. Instead, both are actual behavior. So there's the behavior of feeling something or being afraid or showing fear. That in of itself is a behavior, not simply a emotion. And that's important because then that sort of means that the entire realm of animal thinking, animal emotion, how an animal perceives the environment around them are all within sort of the field of animal behavior, which means that when we're studying sort of dog behavior and training, thinking, thoughts, emotions all sort of fall and are encompassed within that. And we would consider them all behavior to study. So there are important foundations to essentially all behavior. There's natural selection, evolution, there's learning, which occurs within an individual's lifetime, and then also cultural transmission. So I have one of our questions within our reading about cultural transmission. which is something that actually does happen within animals. We always need to be considering all three components when we're trying to study animal behavior, because an animal is behaving within the context of all three of these types of causes of behavior, never just one individually. In other words, there's no animal out there that has not experienced learning relevant to essentially every behavior that they're engaging in. Perhaps unless you're looking at, an animal that is less than a day old or a couple of hours old, typically learning is going to have an important impact on that. At the same time, every animal has evolved through natural selection. There is no, there's no species or individual on this planet who has not been experienced or been changed through genetic selection of some type. And then lastly, for a lot of animals, there seems to be cultural transmission, which is largely defined not necessarily as learning through direct experience, like cause and effect learning or trial and error learning, but rather learning through information that is passed from another member of the species to another member of the species. So we'll talk about an example of this within rodents, and I also provided online into the textbook an example of this within primates. So scavenging in Norwegian rats, there's actually a variety of rat species that do these kinds of things. But say, for example, you observe something like this rat shows a preference for one type of food wrapper versus another wrapper, like an ice cream wrapper versus a burger wrapper. You might ask yourself, why does this rat have this preference? And instead of simply being able to say, because it likes the taste of the ice cream versus the burger, I'd like you to dig deeper, because the next question to that is, well, why? An important thing to pay attention to is my explanation of, well, he just prefers the ice cream flavor. It's not actually an explanation. All you're doing is just rewording the question to begin with, right? So you observed that they chose the ice cream over the burger. So by simply stating that it must be because they like it, you're just restating the fact that the animal has a preference for the ice cream over the burger. You're not providing any explanation at all. You're just restating the same information that you already have. So to try and understand actually why they're choosing the ice cream over the burger, we have to dig a little bit deeper and think about, well, perhaps are there evolutionary reasons for preferring something that might be more sweet, because it's typically associated with a higher energy density. So perhaps rats just have a general preference for sweet because sugar is high in energy, and that natural selection has selected more for a preference for carbohydrate like sugar versus protein like a burger wrapper. Perhaps the animal has a learning experience in which maybe it had a bad learning history with burger before, or perhaps it had a particularly good learning history with ice cream, that they've had it before and it's led to a lot of calories after that and they've felt very full and satisfied. So it increased the probability that they will go for ice cream in the future. So this would be an environmental learning history explanation. And then finally, an interesting thing that happened in our rodents is, well, perhaps they just simply had been around another conspecific or another member of their species that had recently eaten ice cream. And this in of itself can actually cause a preference in rodents to show a preference for what other members of their species have recently eaten. So an example of this is, say for an example, a demonstrator who's over here has recently eaten a hot dog. So a demonstrator eats this hot dog and then essentially goes and interacts with a variety of others. So then the observers, O2, O1, can smell the fact that the others have had hot dogs, and this can actually be passed off either through just regular conspecifics or even through the next generations, that they remember smelling this particular smell on the breath of their parents. So it's just that they actually develop a preference for that particular smell and food choice. So when we observe a behavioral phenomenon that we're particularly interested in trying to understand, we need to be thinking about the various levels of which this behavior might have developed in. So again, we can be thinking about the natural selection history, the learning of the individual, as well as whether they might have learned through transmission of from other individuals. So when we're trying to understand animal behavior, it's really important to come down to empirical questions using the scientific method, which all of you are probably very well familiar with. But looking at things like, well, what is the behavior? When does it occur? Why does it occur? Under what circumstances does it occur? How does it occur? Really in here, what you have to develop is a curiosity rather than simply the animal is doing this because it likes to, or that the animal is doing it because it wants to. These are what we'll learn about are called circular explanations, and they're not explanations at all. Instead, when trying to understand animal behavior, it's really about trying to figure out why. The example of the video that we have with the mobster birds that's uploaded into Blackboard is a really good example of how you take some kind of simple observation and really ask, well, why is this happening? And then set up a variety of different experiments and changing of conditions to better understand under what circumstances is this occurring, why is it happening, and then start thinking about potential reasons why this may have evolved. There are two levels of explanation that I want you to be aware of. One are what we call sort of an ultimate analysis. And this is essentially meaning how evolution and evolutionary forces have come to select for this particular trait within a particular species. Proximate analysis is more about immediate, short-term kind of cause and effect relationships. So things that have occurred within this lifetime of that specific individual. So proximate analysis is focusing more about how does learning and developmental experiences influence a behavior, whereas ultimate analysis is more about what species effects are there in evolutionary forces that have driven or derived this behavior within a particular species in the population. And this directly relates to Tinbergen's 4 questions, which are what we call his 4 whys, or why questions. The first question is about evolution or phylogeny. So essentially inspecting the family tree, which animals show this behavior and which animals do not show this behavior. So if your why is perhaps why did this evolve, one of the simple things you can look at is, well, what related and unrelated animals show this particular behavior to try and understand the evolution of this behavior from a comparative species approach. The next is, well, what function might this behavior have? So what does this behavior achieve? What are the functional or sort of adaptational functions of this? Does this allow an animal more likely to reach an adult stage at which it can reproduce? Does this allow an animal to access more food? What type of long-term evolutionary function might this behavior have? And then the 2 following questions are more about something more in the immediate sort of presence related to the animal, which are causation and ontogeny. And causation is more about what is the sort of neural mechanism that relates to this particular behavior? What is the sort of operant conditioning or learning that has led to this? And then ontogeny is about development. How might this behavior have developed through that individual's lifetime? As you can probably see, that the bottom 2 questions are typically are proximate questions, which proximate, remember, within the individual's lifetime. And the first 2 are more about ultimate, or more about the evolution of this behavior. Typically, in the sort of the realm of different kind of behavioral approaches, psychologists are typically most interested in the bottom 2 questions, mostly about sort of the neuroscience. So causation would be more of a neuroscience field. Ontogeny would be more about a developmental psychology field. And then the ultimate questions like evolutionary and function are typically most interested by a distinct field that is called ethology. It's also a study of animal behavior, largely developed in Europe. And it's different than typically the psychology approach, and then it has a focus of the behavior and sort of the natural environment and trying to understand which species show it, which species don't show it, and how this behavior might have evolved and what sort of ultimate evolutionary functions that particular behavior has. So let's try and apply some of this with a pretty simple question. So a very simple observation you might have is that if you point to like one of two cups, dogs may be very likely to follow it. And in fact, several studies have demonstrated that dogs are quite good at simply following to your pointing gesture to something that you're indicating at or pointing towards. So the first question is, well, of the whys, why might dogs do this? Is there a particular evolutionary reason that dogs might do this? Do all canids do it, or do only some canids do it? So our first kind of ultimate question, or the first why number one, is comparing the evolution and phylogeny of different species and see, do all of these animals do it? So the first question might be is, do wolves also follow point? Do other canid species follow points? Do foxes follow points? Do coyotes follow points? Then subsequently, do non-related species, far out evolutionary tree-wise, follow points? Like, do elephants, seals, cats, birds, do any of these species do it? Do chimpanzees do it? Yeah. And then by comparing which species do and which species don't, you can start to understand what might be deriving this behavior of, say, only dogs do but wolves don't. Then it might relate to domestication as perhaps being an important event within that. If in contrast, dogs and wolves do it, but say cats don't, then it would suggest that it's perhaps something related to canids in general and not necessarily just all of their species. So by addressing this first question, we can start to understand when or why might this perhaps have evolved. Another sort of ultimate question is, well, what sort of selective advantage might this have? It seems like very simple behavior. How could this have led to, more animals reproducing this gene being passed on to be able to follow points? So you can hypothesize that perhaps being able to follow a human's point might lead to higher chances of survival. Perhaps it might lead to more food that would then lead to more offspring. So then you might start wondering, how could this behavior functionally translate into something that might have actually evolved? And we could also look at, how does it develop? Do puppies follow points? Do they have to learn to follow points? Is there experience that makes sense with following points? Which also kind of leads to our mechanistic or causation why number 4 is, does this need to be reinforced? Does the animal have to learn that when they follow a point, they're more likely to get access to some type of food or a reinforcer in the past? Do dogs without a lot of experience with humans also follow points? Do shelter dogs do it? If you adopt shelter dogs, do they become more likely to follow points following adoption than before adoption? These are all questions that you can ask, and despite it being just one simple behavior following a point, all of these questions are important questions to try and understand, why do dogs follow points? Hopefully that makes sense. So next, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the foundations further. So ethology and comparative psychology are both defined as the study of animal behavior. And we talked about that previously, but as you can have seen, they have pretty different approaches. Not because one is wrong and the other is right, but rather they're just focusing at essentially different types or different levels of questions. Typically our ethology is looking more at our evolutionary perspective, and a lot of times comparative psychology and psychology in general is looking more at our proximate analysis. But generally speaking, there's a lot of overlap because they're both interested in animal behavior and the same types of things that animals do. So now let's go off into the history. Your textbook goes through essentially all of the key historical figures within the learning field. So I want to bring in a couple of other historical figures that are not quite discussed, and especially important for ethology is going to be someone you're probably well familiar with, which is Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution by natural selection. The theory itself is very basic, very straightforward and simple. Essentially, the concept is that more offspring are born than typically survive to an older age. There's variation among those offspring. Some of that variation is genetic or inheritable, that variation can be passed on from one generation to the next generation. And some of that variation leads to sort of benefits that allow those individuals more likely to survive, more likely to reach an age to reproduce, and more likely to have offspring in the future, which allows essentially the frequency of that type of variation that has led to it to increase, and variants that were not as successful decrease over time. So it's a very simple observation and quite straightforward, but extremely impactful within both the world of biology as well as animal behavior, and trying to understand where does behavior come from. So a lot of times we'll look at evolution of physiological characteristics, right? Darwin studied the beak sizes of finches, but the same principles can also apply to behavior and psychology of animals. And then comparative psychology also has a couple of, important and powerful weapons that are really important to remember. The first one is Lloyd Morgan's canon. And this basically states, in no case may we interpret an action of the outcome of the exercise of a higher psychical faculty if it can be interpreted by the outcomes of the exercise of one which stands lower in the psychological scale. This is kind of complicated, and some of the thought of it is ultimately outdated, but essentially the principle is that it's important not to assume a very complex cognitive process or a different type of cognitive process within an animal, and even in humans, if the same type of behavior could be observed through a mechanism by which we already have more evidence for an understanding. In other words, it's not uncommon to look at a particular behavior and say the animal must be showing something like feelings of guilt or guilty. So a great example of that is guilt in dogs, right? So if a dog shows certain kind of behavioral signs after they've done something wrong, you might say that the dog must be guilty and feels bad for engaging in that particular behavior. However, Lloyd Morgan's canon would suggest that it's important not to immediately jump to that interpretation, but rather try to establish, is it possible through previous learning and experience that the animal has learned that if they look a certain way after they engage in some bad behavior, it allows them to avoid further punishment. And perhaps what they're responding to is simply your reaction to whatever it is that they did, and not necessarily because they feel bad or a sense of guilt that they knew that there was something morally wrong that they engaged in, like eating out of the trash can, and that they feel guilty, but rather you were there, you saw that there was trash missing, you started yelling at your dog, and then they tucked its tail and started to show signs of guilt. But in reality, what they were doing was simply responding to your angry and loud voice rather than engaging in some type of guilt. So Lloyd Morgan's canon would say that we should not necessarily jump to that conclusion that the animal feels guilty, but rather we should make sure that it couldn't necessarily be explained through one of these other mechanisms. And the short answer is, when scientists have looked at, are there simpler mechanisms that would explain this? The answer is yes. Typically, a dog will show guilty signs whether they engage in a naughty behavior or not. Really all that matters is whether the owner thinks that the dog engaged in a bad behavior or not. which is pretty strong evidence that it's actually the dog's reaction to the owner's behavior rather than a level of guilt. Next is Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is basically a core principle in all research and science. This isn't specific to animal behavior. So the cartoon here is when faced with two possible explanations, the simpler of the two is the most likely to be true. And that's Occam's razor. Essentially, if you have two competing potential explanations, so say, for example, you came home, you saw that the trash had been eaten, you go to your dog and your dog is looking guilty. There's two possible explanations. Your dog truly feels a sense of guilt and that they're sorry for eating that trash, or you noticed that there was some type of something missing. You went and you looked at your dog read that you were upset and started to respond in a guilty way to try and avoid further punishment. These are two competing kinds of explanations. The simpler one would be the one that requires fewer sort of psychological steps, which would be not requiring an understanding of guilt. So Occam's razor would essentially force us to interpret the behavior from a learning perspective versus a perspective of which the animal experiencing some type of guilt. And then the joke is Occam's professor, when faced with two possible ways of doing something, the more complicated one is what your professor will most likely ask you to do, which is essentially the opposite of Occam's razor. I think I've been looking at the wrong screen. I'm sorry. Okay, so let's go over to some YouTube videos. And we're going to practice applying Lloyd Morgan's canon and Occam's razor in a particular situation. So here is a YouTube video watched only 123,000 times. It's quite small. But anyway, about a dog who tries to save a fish in Thailand by splashing it with water. Okay, so off of Occam's razor, Lloyd Morgan's canon, should we immediately assume, as the YouTube video is labeled, that this dog is trying to save this fish's life and provide some type of water resuscitation of the fish? So the first thing is that we need to explore our other potential explanations. Are there other behaviors that dogs engage in that might at least topographically look kind of similar? And under what circumstances do they occur? I don't know what this picture is. So is this dog trying to rescue its food bowl by engaging in some type of similar behavior? Let's take a look at this dog. So is this dog trying to tuck someone in or rescue someone? Are there other related behaviors in similar species from an evolutionary perspective?
Sì, sì, sì.
So this is a wolf pup, and at the beginning was engaging in similar behavior. There's a fox collecting some food. So as you can see here, we have highly similar behavior that's occurring across a variety of species within the canid family. And this is actually a food caching behavior. So Occam's razor and Lloyd Morgan's canid would essentially force us to interpret that first video not as the dog trying to save the fish's life, but rather that it looks like a pretty good meal to the dog, perhaps not something to eat right now, but maybe in the future. So it will engage in this caching type of behavior. Or perhaps it was just elicited by these stimuli. A lot of these types of evolutionary behaviors are elicited when they see particular stimuli, which we'll talk about in a second with fixed action pattern. But this is a type of fixed action pattern actually of food caching. And when they see a particular type of food, it can get triggered by the stimulus, which would then lead to the caching behavior occurring. And in reality, the dog wasn't trying to save the fish, it was just trying to cache it as food. Those are those videos. Okay. So with Charles Darwin, one of the important kinds of questions is, well, what is the biological significance of these behaviors? So when we're trying to understand behavior, it's really important to be thinking about how does this relate to the organism survival within the environment? What is the adaptive significance of any of these kinds of behaviors? Also historically, from an animal cognition perspective, was George Romanes. Particularly interesting because he was one of the first people to ever do a scientific study on dogs' ability to track people. But also he published his book, Animal Intelligence. It wasn't particularly well regarded, largely because it was a report of a variety of anecdotes about what animals could do, which was sort of fraught with just kind of anecdotal stories that wasn't really critical or applying Occam's razor or Lloyd Morgan's canid, which led to it largely being disregarded by the scientific community. Edward Thorndike. Your textbook goes into a lot of depth with Thorndike. This is an example of one of the puzzle boxes he had, a little picture of Thorndike in it in of itself. So essentially what Thorndike did is that he built these little boxes that had little contraptions that would allow the cat to get out of the box and access some food, and found that eventually the cats would sort of, through random processes, come across the mechanism of the box that would open it up. But what the interesting thing was is when you put that animal back in, it got faster and faster every single day, being able to open up that box, such that after a few trials, you put the cat in the box and it immediately goes to the mechanism, opens the mechanism, and gets itself out. Shortly after Thorndike, a few years later, really comes Watson and then modern behaviorism. And so after Thorndike came Watson and his Behaviorist Manifesto, emphasized a variety of kinds of learning theories, classical conditioning, associative models. One of the important things that sort of came out of this American behaviorism, which is quite different than sort of the ethology perspective, is that there's a lot of focus on sort of model species under laboratory and controlled conditions. Ethologists were more interested in the behavior of an animal in its natural environment, and psychologists were more interested in how does the way that we arrange reinforcers, punishers, conditioning stimuli lead to important differences in behavior. Both fields are quite necessary because ultimately, to understand the animal, you need to answer both questions, both the ultimate and the proximate. Behaviorism was really the sort of experimental laboratory study of proximate mechanisms, and ethology has largely been the real world understanding of ultimate mechanisms. Following Watson sort of came radical behaviorism, led by B.F. Skinner, and is really more of what is now modern day behaviorism. It was mostly emphasizing prediction and control of behavior under laboratory conditions. If we could identify how can we produce this behavior and stop this behavior, then we kind of have an understanding of why this behavior is occurring. And that's largely been the focus of modern behaviorism, and is actually sort of the take of our textbook. It's really the following up of, or sort of the modern day version of what was started by Skinner in the 1950s. Simultaneously, there's also a more ethological approach, which is more from the evolution, as we said, evolution of behavior that developed especially strong in Europe, less so within the Americas. It was emphasis on diversity of behavior across species, so really comparing a variety of species. Konrad Lorenz was probably one of the most famous ethologists, as well as Nico Tinbergen. Remember Tinbergen's 4 questions. They shared a Nobel Prize in the study of ethology in the 1970s. The concept of imprinting, of yeast imprinting on a human and following them, these were all concepts that were largely coming out of ethology and Konrad Lorenz specifically. Ethology sort of largely emphasized, and still does, a lot of aspects of sort of genetics, roles of instinct, behavioral characteristics that essentially occur within all of the members of a particular species, and have little influence of individual experiences. So behaviors that essentially, because you're a member of this species, is likely to happen. And this is where fixed action patterns come in. I mentioned them briefly with caching behavior. These are stereotyped patterns of behavior, meaning that they're very inflexible. They don't change the way that they look. They look quite similar across essentially all members of that species. We're looking at the caching behavior. This is actually somewhat flexible to learning and experience. It's not completely what we would call a fixed action pattern per se. Nowadays, we just refer to them as action patterns because they tend to be less fixed than we initially thought. But it is a very stereotyped behavior. What we mean by that is that it looks almost the same across nearly every individual and across a variety of different closely related individual species. A fixed action pattern compared to just like a modal action pattern or just an action pattern. Once a particular stimulus triggers it to engage in, essentially the animal goes through the entire sequence, regardless of any kinds of changes or manipulations of feedback within that sequence. And an example of that is here with the gray-legged goose. So this is an egg rolling behavior of a gray-legged goose. What you'll notice is that the egg is kind of moved out from the nest. This is a sign stimulus that triggers an action pattern or behavior of the goose to roll this egg back into the nest. One of the things that you'll notice is that the experimenter will take the egg away and it doesn't actually change the behavior whatsoever. Once that behavior is triggered, it is going to go and it's going to run to completion, essentially no matter what happens at this point. It takes the egg away and they continue to try and tuck it away, even though there's no nest to take away. So this is the typical behavior pattern. You take it away and they continue to engage in that behavior at all. So this is what we call a fixed action pattern because it's largely fixed. Oh my goodness, what is this? Anyway, because it's quite fixed, once it's triggered and the behavior starts, it will run till completion. And that's the video. In the 1960s, this is largely where cognitive psychology came from or started and became particularly popular. And really what this was, it was a focus of a study of more complex behavioral phenomena that had been traditionally studied by the psychologists in the 1950s, looking at animals with levers and very simplistic systems that gave us a ton of information. But by the time we got to the 1960s, 1970s, it was thought that we need to start evaluating more complicated behaviors within the animals that we see, as well as within humans in general. A lot of times there was a lot of concern for things like anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism within sort of cognitive psychology, but it still remains an experimental science, but tends to be less concerned with parsimony and explanation than what ethologists and behaviorists tend to do so. And we'll talk a little bit about anthropomorphism in just a second. Importantly, as we talk about these different kinds of fields and different sort of areas of sciences, they sort of developed because of different historical reasons, and they tend to focus on overlapping but different aspects of a particular behavior. But because this is science versus sports, this isn't like your team is always right and the one that you will always support no matter what. It's more of science, which means that all of these different areas give us important, sometimes overlapping, sometimes non-overlapping things, and essentially we kind of support all of them rather than just simply buying into one of them and this is correct, or behaviorism is the only way, or ethology is the only way, which a lot of times there tends to be a lot of fighting or differences in perspective in there. But for the most part, really, it's about a scientific attitude of trying to understand what's going on, and wherever the data seems to make the most sense overall is essentially the team per se that you support, not necessarily just pick one and say, I'm a behaviorist or I'm an ethologist. Really, a scientist, you're all of them. So what is anthropomorphism? Anthropos comes from man, morph comes from shape. The original history of the word is actually quite historic and was used to refer to a mortal sin of assuming that God had some type of human-like characteristics. So it would be attributed whenever people would talk about God in a way that was kind of human-like. And then that was sort of co-opted later in the animal sciences area to also be kind of a sin in a sense. And that is talking of animals as essentially being humans. So examples of this would be Dr. Dolittle, or a variety of Disney movies like Finding Nemo, where we essentially assume that animals talk and think just like us. they just have a different animal language, or the dogs have a dog language, but in reality, they're talking to each other just like we would be talking to each other. And this is anthropomorphism. It's generally within comparative psychology and ethology and behaviorism, thought of as a sin. This is something that we should not do, largely because it does a couple of different things. One, it tends to prevent us from actually exploring what is that animal's sort of psychology, what is that animal's understanding of the world around us, if we're just assuming that it's like ours, or that because they do a particular behavior, the reason for that behavior is the same reason why you would do it, which is incorrect and is an assumption that tends to get us into trouble sometimes. So it's important to not be trying to see the animal through a human lens, but trying to see the animal through their own lenses. Anthropocentrism is similar, but it's mostly the tendency to see other species from a human perspective. This we can't necessarily help because there are just a lot of things that we can't really experience. A good example of that is the dog's sense of smell, or a bird's vision, or a dog's sense of hearing. We can't really understand what it's like to be them, or a bat that echolocates. You just can't, contemplate or really think about what is it like to be an echolocating bat. So anthropocentrism definitely can lead to limitations in the science and studies that we do, but it is sometimes hard to get around. An example of this is, with a bird or a bee that can see within the UV light. We might look at this, the picture on the left, and we see this bright yellow flower, but to the picture on the right, the birds and the bees see a very different world and image. And there's not much we can do about it, but we need to be conscientious of it, that the animals do not see the same world that we see, and that there can be quite a big difference. And a good example of this was some studies in which they were trying to study cuckoo birds, putting their eggs in the nest. Our video talks a lot about this, and that's what we'll talk about in our discussion, not necessarily with cuckoos, but with cowbirds. But in one of the experimenters, they had a condition where they placed fake eggs within the nest. But for some reason, the songbirds would reject those eggs, but not reject the cuckoo bird eggs. And the question was, well, why? Why would they reject what the experimenter put in so readily, but not sort of the real cuckoo egg? What was the difference? Because this was a picture of one of their fake eggs, and you can see how it looks almost identical within the nest. But then when they shined it under a UV light, they found that it actually glowed this kind of bright blue color. So it was actually really easy from the bird's perspective to say, that doesn't look like my egg. Whereas from the human perspective, it looks almost identical. So it was only because we were seeing the world through a human lens that we weren't able to realize why this behavior was occurring and why they were having no issues understanding what was a real, what was fake. It was simply because we were failing to consider from the bird's perspective what the egg actually looked like. Another example of not thinking about sort of our animal's environment is that there was a study that suggested that dogs tend to align themselves along the north and south poles when taking a poop. So, we tend to not think that we have a magnetic sense. Some people, there's a little bit of evidence that potentially disagrees, but for the most part, there's not really any great research that suggests that we have a strong sense of what is our magnetic north and magnetic south. However, there does seem to be some evidence that our dogs actually do. So when our dog is sort of walking in circles right before they're ready to use the bathroom, and we're wondering why in the world that they're doing this, well, perhaps it's related to sort of the magnetic north and south poles, and we just are completely ignorant to that. Anthropocentrism sort of being sort of the main driver of it is that we're seeing the dogs, or perception of the dog's world, through our own lenses, not necessarily thinking about, well, what are the dog's experiences and what might the dog be perceiving? So importantly, trying to recognize these limitations that we have as researchers to try and better understand the animal by trying to look more through their lenses versus our own lenses is quite important. And then lastly, to kind of recap what we've been talking about, we've talked about behaviorism, some of the historical figures of behaviorism like Watson, Thorndike, and Skinner. Ethology, Konrad Lorenz, Nico Tinbergen's 4 questions, cognitive psychology, as well as comparative psychology, how cognitive psychology has led to a revolution of considering more complicated questions, comparative psychology, importantly, comparing a variety of species together. The 4 questions looking at the proximate and ultimate questions being evolutionary questions where we compare species that show a behavior to species that don't show a behavior, and then try and identify adaptive functions of that behavior, as well as the 2 proximate questions, which look at, well, what are the mechanisms and how does it develop within an individual's lifetime? So in other words, what is sort of the neuroscientific mechanisms, as well as what are the learning mechanisms that might be related to that particular behavior? And then lastly, be able to identify, describe anthropomorphism, how it can lead to problems within science, as well as anthropocentrism and that differentiation. All right, so that wraps up basically our first weeks of lecture. What I'm expecting from you for this week is to watch this video, watch the discussion video, as well as done the reading and respond to the discussion questions in the reading. So those 3 things together essentially encompass our efforts. And if you're not coming into class, not going into a discussion, then watching one of the discussion videos that we're able to put up. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a great week.